Good afternoon. You're watching ET Now with me, Ruchi, Bhatia. Joining us now on ET Now is the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Many thanks for taking your time out and speaking to us at ET Now after Moody's. Positive commentary now coming in from S&P Global Ratings as well. I want to ask you, sir, because some time ago, when the ratings came in from Moody's and they had downgraded us, you were fairly confident that the other rating agencies won't do so. So has this come in as a reprieve or was it on expected lines?
Thanks a lot, Ruchi. Very good evening and good evening, viewers. Of course, one would want to think about this as a good step. While we actually were fairly confident, but I think there's always can be many a slip between the cup and the lip. So it's good to that the rating has been maintained, and we're quite glad about it because apart from the rating itself, what the commentary that they've given, which is actually more balanced and reflective of the fundamentals. What they're focused on is the fact that India's growth rate, among its peers, outperforms compared to other countries, which is quite important because even from a debt sustainability perspective, it's growth that matters the most to ensure that debt remains sustainable. Also, they've actually focused on the steps that we've taken on the reform side as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. I think so. They're acknowledging the fact that the reform measures can actually have a good push for growth.
So I want to ask you, and since you mentioned about reforms, on the ongoing reforms, S&P 500 S&P has also said that if executed well, the reforms will keep India's growth ahead of its peers. However, if you look at critical reforms like land and labor, they have been stuck. On the other hand, even though states have now bitten the bullet on labor reforms, it has come at the cost of labor themselves or employees themselves. So what is the government going to do in the days to come to walk the talk on critical reforms?
Ruchi, first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind the reforms that have already been undertaken. Let's take agriculture, which accounts for almost 45% of the population and therefore contributes significantly to our per capita income. The APMC reforms that are actually being undertaken, contract farming, which reduces the volatility that typically farmers face, the changes to the Essential Commodities Act, these are very, very important reforms that actually need to be acknowledged not only in terms of the 70 years of independence, but if you go back in history, some of these restrictions for farmers being able to sell their produce where they want, those were there since the times of Alauddin Khilji. So these are a very important part. Second, if you look at on the privatization bit, the clear agenda for privatization that has been laid, which goes back again, if you think about from a historical perspective, in 1955, when the industrial policy was announced then in the socialist era, the commanding heights of the economy were given to the public sector enterprises. And in fact, even after 3 decades of market-oriented reforms, we did not basically articulate a clear strategy for the role of private enterprise in the economy. And that's also been done. So these are very important reforms that will bring in productivity. On the labor side, states are actually moving towards not only easing the compliance that burden that firms face, but at the same time also making it more flexible for firms to be able to hire workers. And that is important because if you look at our labor force, about 89% of it remains in the informal sector. And as a result, good employment in the formal sector, there isn't adequate numbers of it. And these reforms will enable on that count and thereby bring in investment as well.
I want to ask you, another part of the commentary that S&P also gave, wherein they said that on the downside, they've mentioned that the ratings could come under pressure over the next 1 to 2 years if fiscal deficit is higher than forecast. These are extraordinary times. You yourself have also alluded to the fact that the government may perhaps breach the fiscal targets that were initially set out. What seems to be the Lakshman Rekha for the government during times like these?
So, Ruchi, here it's important to note that S&P has in fact acknowledged that this year there will be an increase in the debt to GDP ratios because fiscal deficits will be higher. What they're commenting upon is the path of debt to GDP of the path of the debt to GDP ratio from next year onwards, which itself critically depends on the growth path that we will accomplish. Because in our interactions with them, we had highlighted that when you look at the debt sustainability, it depends, in any economy on the difference between the nominal rate of growth and the nominal rate of borrowing, but more so in the Indian context, because nominal rate of growth has historically been about 4.5% greater than the nominal rate of borrowing. And using that, they've also projected that provided growth comes back to normal levels from next year onwards, it would not be a problem. What they're pointing out is if that doesn't happen, debt sustainability might become a problem. But I don't see that as that much of a risk because of the supply side reforms that we're implementing, which will bring in productivity improvement and bring in investment as well, and thereby actually bring back the growth path.
Right. Having said that, sir, recently we have also seen, just moving a little bit away from the commentary coming in from S&P, the government is looking at moving on an austerity path. The Department of Expenditure recently not just announced cuts in terms of new schemes, but also said that for any scheme which is more than 500 crore rupees, special permissions now will have to be taken by Finance Ministry, even though if the scheme has already been approved in the budget or not. Having said that, is this really going to be the path that the government is going to undertake, and does that significantly mean that there's going to be a change in the way the expenditure was initially perceived in the budget itself?
So there are two aspects to this, Ruchi. One is for this particular year, given that our revenues are going to take a hit this year, it is important to actually tighten our belts. And that's what the particular directives that you're talking about are really about, which is to ensure that our expenditures are, to the largest extent possible, are kept under check. Of course, expenditures for the flagship schemes, those that actually matter for the, for the welfare of the masses, those cannot be, cannot be cut. But while, ensuring that is not done, we can still tighten our belts, and that is what has been done, number one. The second part is that it's also important, during times like these, to take the opportunity and try and streamline some of the expenditures, especially those that, are inefficient. And that's an exercise also that it's useful to undertake during these times, so that the equilibrium between revenues and expenditures are brought and made more sustainable.
Right. So before I let you go, and this is going to be my last question, a lot is also being talked about with respect to how whether our financial system at this point of time will be able to take the load within the economy itself. How open is the Finance Ministry to the idea of recapitalizing banks? A lot of banks we're now seeing, as in how their results are coming, that many retail loans are also seeking moratorium. At a later stage, maybe post-September, how open is the government to the idea of recapitalizing, if not bigger banks, then at least the smaller banks?
Ruchi, a couple of points that need to be kept in mind here is, one, when you look at the way a lot of the measures under the stimulus package have been designed, they've been done in such a way that when the loans come back into, when they mature, at that time we may be in a much better growth path. And as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's the thought that is actually underlying this particular design. Just to give an example, take the 3 lakh crore package, MSME package. which basically is 100% guaranteed by the government. This year, there is there's a moratorium actually, or a holiday on all interest and principal repayments. As a result, there is no cost that will come this year. And these are 4-year loans, which many of them will mature, 3 years hence, and thereby will provide the opportunity for growth to pick up, and also in that process, create the opportunity for some of these losses to be minimized. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Second, if you look at the capitalization of the of our banking sector, the Basel norms require capital at 8%, and our banks on average are at 13% more, so excess of 13%. So there's a 5% cushion, and in banks, because these are highly leveraged entities across the world, even a 1% cushion translates into significant level of comfort. So our banks are actually well capitalized, even if you look at the difference between public versus private sector banks, and on average, private sector banks do have greater capital. Even then, public sector banks are also well capitalized. That said, the government remains, committed to ensure that whatever needs to be done, will be done.
Okay, all right. On that note, sir, always a pleasure chatting with you and getting in your perspective. That was the Chief Economic Advisor in conversation with ET Now, talking about the good news coming in from rating agency S&P. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
All right.